October 15th. The fog was thick that night, rolling through the suburban streets of Seattle like a shroud. Jake Thompson pulled his jacket tighter around him as he walked down the empty sidewalks, the chill of autumn biting at his skin. It had become something of a ritual for him, late-night walks to clear his mind, to try and shake off the lingering heaviness of the breakup that still weighed on him. The quiet, the solitude, the cold air, it all helped, if only a little. But lately those walks had taken on a different tone. There was something unsettling in the air. The fog seemed denser, the night quieter, and above all, Jake had started to feel as though he was not alone. It wasn't every night, but sometimes out of the corner of his eye, he would catch the outline of a figure, someone lurking in the distance, just far enough away that he could never quite make them out. Always there, just at the edge of his vision, disappearing when he turned to get a better look. Jake tried to ignore it at first, writing it off as his imagination, a trick played by the swirling fog and his own loneliness. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of his mind, making him glance over his shoulder more often, quicken his pace when the air grew colder. It was just a feeling, he told himself, nothing more. Then the notes began to appear. It started innocently enough. A folded piece of paper on his doorstep, written in a hurried scrawl, "You shouldn't walk alone at night." Jake frowned at the message, assuming it was just some strange prank by one of the neighborhood kids. He tossed it in the trash and went on with his day. But the notes kept coming, each one more unnerving than the last. "I see you. You won't be alone forever. You can't run from me." The worst part wasn't the words, it was the details. They knew things about him, things only someone close would know. His favorite route through the neighborhood, the name of the restaurant where he'd taken his ex for their last date, his middle name. Each note felt like a piece of his life had been peeled back and exposed, and it made his skin crawl. Jake tried to ignore the fear, tried to act as though he wasn't afraid. But the nights became harder, the walks shorter, until he couldn't bring himself to leave his house after dark. He stayed in, the blinds drawn, jumping at every creak of the old house, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. It was a week later, on another fog-filled night, that everything came crashing down. He hadn't meant to leave the house that night, but something drove him out, a restlessness he couldn't contain. He walked the familiar streets, his eyes darting from side to side, the fog swallowing the world around him. And then he saw it. The figure standing still, watching him from across the street. This time it didn't disappear. It stepped forward. Jake's heart pounded, his feet frozen in place. The figure moved closer, the fog shifting to reveal a face, one he almost recognized. Before he could react, the figure lunged, knocking him to the ground. Jake fought back, adrenaline flooding his veins, his fists connecting with something solid. The attacker grunted, their hood falling back, revealing long, tangled hair. In the scuffle, something fell from their neck, a pendant, glinting in the faint light of the street lamp. Jake scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, and ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was back inside his house. The door slammed shut and locked behind him. He leaned against the door, his heart racing, his mind spinning. The pendant. He had seen it before. It belonged to her. The next morning, Jake took the pendant to the police. He was done trying to handle this on his own. The officer at the front desk listened to his story, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. He called in Detective Sarah Lang, a woman known for her sharp instincts and tenacity. She listened as Jake recounted everything, the notes, the figure, the attack. When he handed her the pendant, her eyes narrowed. "This belonged to my ex-girlfriend," Jake said, his voice shaking. She died. Or at least, I thought she did. It was a car accident years ago. They never found her body." Detective Lang took the pendant, her gaze thoughtful. "I'll look into it," she said. "But if what you're saying is true, then we might be dealing with something far more complicated than just a stalker." Days passed, and Jake stayed inside, waiting for news. Detective Lang called him in, her voice urgent. She had found an old police report, a missing person from 2 decades ago, a woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The pendant had belonged to her too. It was a link, a thread that tied together a series of disappearances that spanned decades. The pieces started to fit together, and Jake's heart sank. The person stalking him wasn't just anyone. It was his ex-girlfriend, the woman he had thought was gone forever. And she wasn't done with him yet. The final note came a week later, slipped under his door in the dead of night. "Meet me at the park. Midnight." Detective Lang insisted on going with him, but Jake refused. This was something he had to face alone. He arrived at the park, the fog thick and heavy, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw her. She stepped out of the fog, her face pale, her eyes hollow. It was her, but not. Her movements were jerky, her expression twisted with anger. "You left me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "You let me die." Jake shook his head, tears filling his eyes. "I thought you were gone. I didn't know." She lunged at him, her hands cold as they wrapped around his throat. Jake struggled, his mind racing. The pendant. It was still in his pocket. He pulled it out, pressing it into her hand. For a moment, her grip loosened, her eyes widening as she looked at the pendant. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, and then she was gone, dissolving into the fog, leaving Jake alone, gasping for breath. Detective Lang found him minutes later, her flashlight cutting through the fog. She rushed to his side, her eyes filled with concern. "Jake, are you okay?" He nodded, his hands trembling as he held up the pendant. "She's gone. I think it's over." Detective Lang helped him to his feet, her expression unreadable. "Let's get you out of here." As they walked away from the park, the fog began to lift, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. Jake knew that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Not really. The memories, the fear, the questions, they would linger. But for now, he was alive, and that was enough. Story 2. Lisa Harper had always been a little wary of moving to Los Angeles. The city was so much bigger, so much busier than anywhere she'd lived before. But she was determined to push herself out of her comfort zone, and when she found a small apartment in a historic downtown building, she thought it was the perfect place to start her new adventure. It helped that her roommate, Emily Rogers, was fun and outgoing, the kind of person who could light up a room and make anyone feel at home. Their building had a reputation, though. It was old, with creaky floors, narrow hallways, and a lot of history. Emily, fascinated by the paranormal, loved to talk about its haunted past. She often joked about the ghost stories, saying they should invite the spirits to their next movie night. Lisa always laughed it off, dismissing the strange noises they sometimes heard as just the building settling. But lately, the noises had been getting worse, more persistent, more rhythmic, almost like footsteps pacing in the hallway at night. Lisa tried to ignore it, but the unease was starting to creep in. One weekend when Emily was away at an audition, Lisa decided to do some minor renovations. She'd always wanted to make the place feel a little more like home, and maybe fixing up some of the creaky spots would help put her mind at ease. That's when she found the diary. It was hidden behind a loose panel in the wall, its cover worn and pages yellowed with age. Lisa opened it, her curiosity piqued. The entries were dated from the 1940s and described strange events in the building, residents who had vanished without a trace, strange symbols found etched into the walls, and an oppressive feeling that seemed to linger in the air. Lisa's unease grew with each entry she read, the words painting a picture of a building with a dark, unsettling history. When Emily came back, Lisa showed her the diary. Emily, of course, was thrilled. "This is amazing," she said, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's like we're living in our own horror movie." Lisa couldn't help but smile at her roommate's enthusiasm, but deep down, a part of her wished she'd never found the diary at all. Then, one night, Emily disappeared. Lisa came home from work to find the apartment empty. At first, she thought Emily might have gone out, but her phone was still on the kitchen counter and her purse was on the couch. There was an unfinished note on the table, the ink smeared as if Emily had been interrupted mid-sentence. Lisa's heart pounded as she called out for her roommate, her voice echoing through the empty apartment. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of Emily. Lisa called the police, but they treated it as if Emily had just left on her own. People come and go all the time, they said. But Lisa knew better. Something was wrong. Desperate for answers, Lisa began to search the apartment, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. That's when she noticed the symbols. They were etched into the walls, barely visible beneath layers of paint, but they matched the descriptions in the diary. Her hands trembled as she traced the lines, a chill running down her spine. That night, as Lisa lay in bed, she heard something coming from Emily's room, a soft rustling, followed by a faint voice. "Lisa!" It was Emily's voice, but it sounded wrong, distorted, like it was coming from far away. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she got up, her feet carrying her to her roommate's door. She pushed it open, her heart pounding. A shadowy figure stood in the center of the room, its form shifting, almost like it was trying to mimic Emily. It turned towards Lisa, its face a blur, its voice echoing. "Lisa, help me!" Lisa slammed the door shut, her hands shaking. She grabbed the diary, her eyes scanning the pages, searching for anything that might help. The entries spoke of rituals, of ways to ward off the darkness that had taken the residence. Lisa knew she had to try. She couldn't lose Emily, not like this. The next day, Lisa went to the library, diving into the building's history. She found old records, newspaper clippings about tenants who had vanished, all in the same eerie manner. The building, it seemed, had a pattern. People disappearing every few decades, always leaving behind the same symbols, the same unanswered questions. Back at the apartment, Lisa continued her search, her eyes drawn to a section of the wall that seemed different. The paint was newer, the edges slightly uneven. She grabbed a hammer, her heart pounding as she began to chip away at the plaster. Behind the wall, she found a hidden room. A small, dark space filled with ritualistic items, candles, and a collection of belongings that could only have come from the missing tenants. In the center of the room was something that made Lisa's blood run cold. A photo of Emily, her face frozen in fear. Lisa knew what she had to do. She gathered the items described in the diary, setting them up in the hidden room. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as if they were alive. She could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of whatever had taken Emily. With the diary in one hand, Lisa began to read aloud, her voice trembling but determined. The shadows seemed to writhe, the air growing thick with an unnatural chill. The figure appeared again, its form shifting, its voice echoing through the room. "Lisa, you can't stop this." But Lisa didn't stop. She kept reading, her voice growing stronger, the words flowing from her lips with a power she hadn't known she possessed. The shadows recoiled, the figure's form flickering, its voice turning into a wail of anger and pain. With a final, desperate shout, Lisa finished the ritual. The room seemed to explode with light, the shadows dissipating, the air clearing. Lisa collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment there was silence. Then, a soft voice. "Lisa?" She looked up, her eyes filling with tears as she saw Emily standing in the doorway, her face pale but alive. Lisa scrambled to her feet, rushing to her roommate, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. Emily hugged her back, her body trembling. "I don't know what happened. I was here, and then it was like I was somewhere else." Lisa pulled back, her eyes meeting Emily's. "It's over now. Whatever it was, it's gone." They left the hidden room behind, sealing it up once more. The diary, now worn and tattered, was locked away, its secrets buried with the building's dark past. As they sat together in the living room, the morning sun beginning to filter through the windows, Lisa knew they had faced something beyond understanding, but they had faced it together, and they had won. "No more ghost stories," Lisa said, her voice tired but relieved. Emily smiled, leaning her head against Lisa's shoulder. Agreed. Let's stick to movie nights from now on. And with that, they stayed there, the warmth of the morning sun slowly dispelling the darkness that had once gripped their home. Story 3. Ethan Miller was not one to believe in ghosts. As a journalist specializing in supernatural phenomena for a niche magazine, his job was to find the truth hidden behind the myths, to separate fact from fiction. Skeptical by nature, Ethan had never encountered anything he couldn't explain. But when he was assigned to investigate the legend of the Whispering Spirits at the Hollow Creek Inn, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. After all, the secluded bed and breakfast in rural Vermont had a reputation that seemed too perfect for his column. The inn was owned by Margaret Maggie Holloway, a widow in her 60s with a gentle smile but eyes that held untold stories. She welcomed Ethan with open arms, showing him to his room and telling him to make himself comfortable. The inn itself was charming with creaky floors and vintage furniture that gave it a timeless quality. But it was the surrounding woods that captured Ethan's attention. Dark, dense, and shrouded in mist, they seemed almost alive, whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. His first night at the inn, Ethan heard it. A faint whisper, just outside his window. He sat up, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. The sound was soft, like children giggling, their voices carried on the wind. He got up, pulled on his coat, and went outside, the cold air biting at his skin. But there was nothing. No one. Just the mist swirling between the trees and the distant call of an owl. He shook his head, dismissing it as the wind, and went back inside. The next morning, over a cup of coffee, Maggie shared the local legend. She spoke of the children who had vanished during a snowstorm decades ago, their spirits said to haunt the woods, luring unsuspecting guests away from the safety of the inn. Ethan listened, his skepticism intact, but he couldn't deny the chill that ran down his spine as Maggie described the guests who had vanished, never to be seen again. She spoke with a quiet sadness, her gaze drifting to the forest beyond the window. Ethan decided to do some investigating. He walked the perimeter of the inn, his camera in hand, documenting everything he could. As he rounded the corner, he noticed something peculiar. Footprints in the fresh snow, small and light, leading from his window towards the forest. He followed them for a few yards before they vanished, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. There were no signs of anyone entering or leaving. It was impossible, yet there it was. That night, Ethan set up his recording equipment. He wanted proof, something tangible to take back with him. As he lay in bed, the whispers returned, growing louder, more distinct. He hit record, the red light blinking in the darkness. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, and then he heard his name. Ethan. His heart raced as the whispers continued, each one revealing something personal, details about his life that no one should know. The next morning, Ethan confronted Maggie. He showed her the recordings, his voice edged with frustration and fear. How do they know these things? Who's behind this? Maggie's face paled, her hands trembling as she listened to the voices. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with tears. "My husband," she said quietly. "He disappeared, just like the others. I think he was taken by them." Ethan's skepticism began to waver. There was something here, something he couldn't explain. He decided to dig deeper, to find the truth behind the whispers. Maggie led him to an old shed at the edge of the property, its door hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, they found boxes of old belongings, relics from Maggie's family, items that seemed out of place. Among them, Ethan found a journal, its pages filled with strange symbols and notes about rituals, sacrifices meant to appease the spirits of the woods. Maggie looked at Ethan, her eyes hollow. "I think my family started this. The spirits, they were never meant to be here. They were brought, bound to this place by something dark." Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't just write a story about this. He had to end it. Together, he and Maggie ventured into the woods, the mist thick around them, the whispers growing louder with each step. The air was cold, biting, and Ethan could feel the weight of the spirits, their presence pressing down on him. They followed the whispers to an old, abandoned cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. The walls were covered in the same symbols from the journal, and in the center of the room lay a circle of stones, blackened by fire. Ethan and Maggie knew they had to perform the ritual, to break the cycle of disappearances, to free the spirits from the bonds that held them. Maggie lit the candles, her hands shaking, while Ethan read from the journal, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, the shadows in the room shifting, forming into figures, the lost children, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in sorrow. They reached out, their voices mingling with Ethan's, a cacophony of pain and longing. Ethan's vision blurred, the room spinning as the ritual reached its peak. He could feel the spirits pulling at him, trying to drag him away, to take him as they had taken the others. Maggie's voice broke through the chaos, her hand gripping his, grounding him. "Finish it, Ethan. You have to finish it." With a final desperate shout, Ethan completed the ritual. The air seemed to shatter, the whispers turning into a wail that echoed through the woods. The spirits faded, their forms dissolving into the mist, leaving only silence behind. Ethan collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Maggie beside him, her face wet with tears. For a moment, there was only stillness. Then, the mist began to lift, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The weight that had hung over the inn seemed to vanish, the air lighter, the forest no longer whispering its dark secrets. Ethan looked at Maggie, his voice barely a whisper. "It's over. We did it." Maggie nodded, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything." They made their way back to the inn, the morning sun warming their faces. Ethan knew that the story he had come to write was not the one he would be telling. This was no longer about debunking a myth. It was about a darkness that had been faced, a curse that had been broken. And as they stepped through the door of the Hollow Creek Inn, Ethan knew that, for the first time, he truly believed.